Firstly, I just want to say thanks to everyone for making the time to come today, and also thanks to Krista for inviting me to be here. So as I was saying before everybody arrived, I had some Wi-Fi issues this morning and had to make a quick move from my office to sit right next to the router. So just to manage expectations, I'm not planning to play any kind of piano concert after the talk. So for the last few years, my research has been about media participants and what their perspective tells us about the creative industries. So I've recently published this book, which is about people who've taken part in documentaries, and it explores their experiences with the media and how they're influenced by working practices and conditions. Since then, I've also started a new project, which is about children's creative labour, which looks at what kind of working environment the industries are providing for children and how it might impact on their longer term well-being. So what I want to talk to you about today is one of the themes which has come up over and over again during my research, whenever people ask about my project and also during my research interviews with the contributors themselves. That theme is exploitation and the pervasive idea that when ordinary people take part in the media, there's an inherent risk that they will be exploited. So what I want to do today is spend a bit of time unpicking this idea, thinking about its current resonance and its history, and then how it relates to theoretical constructs. I'm then going to share a few examples from my research where the productions were explicitly called out for exploitative practice, and then tell you how the contributors themselves saw the situation. So the idea of exploitation, I think, has got a particular resonance in the cultural moment that we're living in. There's a confluence of various factors which tends to come up in debates, both in public discussions and in the scholarship, which is seen to make this a particularly perilous time for people to appear on screen. Since the millennium, we've had the advent of reality TV and a turn towards more formatted or confrontational styles of programming. Annette Hill talks about how shame and humiliation are central to the role that participants play in these types of productions. They're parachuted into emotionally fraught situations and provoked into having these extreme reactions. And this is where the entertainment value of these types of programs lies. Over the last 10 or 15 years, social media has become an increasingly important way of generating noise, as Anamik Saha puts it, which is designed to bring viewers to productions. This involves giving platforms to contentious people and contentious issues, or positioning ordinary people as targets for critical commentary in the tabloid press or on social media. These days, to go on TV is to risk being hate-watched or trolled by the public, and as scholars such as Sarah De Benedictis and Bev Skeggs point out, it's often marginalised people such as white working-class women, people on benefits, or the obese, who are presented in this kind of way to draw boundaries around what's considered appropriate social conduct. There's also the longevity of digital texts, where embarrassing moments and fleeting errors of judgment are not only preserved, but are easily accessible for a seemingly infinite amount of time. Clips and screen grabs can be lifted out of context, repurposed and recycled in unexpected or unintended ways, which are often completely disconnected from where they've originated. During the time that I was writing my book, the industry went through a very public duty of care crisis, prompted by the suicides of a number of contestants on Love Island and The Jeremy Kyle Show. The media was strongly criticised for what was seen as a culture of treating people with less respect than they deserved and putting their well-being secondary to their own commercial interests. And then there's also been the boom in online content creation and the apparent difficulties in regulating this new zone of production. Some of you might have seen this recent documentary on Netflix, for example, which is called Bad Influence, which draws attention to the potential for child content creators to earn huge sums of money, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation from their parents and from platforms. So these issues appear to relate specifically to this particular cultural moment, but as much as contributor exploitation might seem to be a modern concern, if we look at the issues from a historical perspective, we can see that the argument actually has a much longer lineage. Documentary is often positioned as a contrast point to reality TV, representing a more considered way of engaging with contributors and a greater level of seriousness, maybe, or ethical value. But as any documentary scholar could tell you, if you look at the canon, it's riven with stories of exploitation and morally dubious behaviour. In the 1920s, Nanook of the North depicted the everyday lives of Indigenous people living in the barren lands of northeastern Canada. But since the death of the documentary's director, Robert Flaherty, in 1951, there's been increasing criticism of his treatment of Nanook and his family, who were exposed to physical dangers during the shoot, hunting walruses and bears without their rifles, for example, because the filmmakers wanted to erase all signs of encroaching modern life. Despite the presence of his wife on the shoot, Flaherty began a sexual relationship with one of his contributors, who was 5 months pregnant with his child by the time the film wrapped. The documentary was a huge global success, and the image of Nanook was used to advertise everything from chocolate bars to cleaning products. But living in such an isolated location, where their only regular contact with the outside world was the arrival of the postal ship once a year, the family didn't have much awareness of what was happening elsewhere and saw little benefit from this fame. Nanook himself died during particularly brutal winter the following year, and Flaherty never returned to the Arctic or met the son that he'd abandoned. Claims of financial exploitation are also common in documentaries. The teacher from Etré et Avoir tried to sue the director, Nicolas Philibert, saying he was told it would only be a small documentary for educational purposes and not the big cinematic release it became. And the cast of Paris is Burning also threatened legal action when they didn't receive what they saw as a fair share of the film's financial success. One of the participants, Pepper LeBeige, was quoted in the New York Times saying, "I feel betrayed. They all got rich and we got nothing." Another common complaint is that contributors had little awareness of the film's likely impact on their lives or were misled about a filmmaker's intentions. A high-profile example is Margie Ratcliffe, who's recently spoken out in criticism of The Staircase. So this was the true crime documentary series that was made about the death of her mother, which was later remade as a drama and then again as a film. Ratcliffe says she originally agreed to take part to support her father, who'd been accused of the crime, but instead they found their family at the centre of intense speculation and amateur sleuthing, which went on and on for decades and had a hugely detrimental impact on their lives. She's described the series as a huge invasion of privacy and has become an advocate for contributors' rights. And my new research project is about child participants. And as we all know, there's a long-standing stereotype around child stars in the creative industries who are supposedly given too much too young, turning them from angels into monsters. In their adult lives, we're told that they're at risk of being addicts, going bankrupt, and having public meltdowns. It's been really interesting to trace these stereotypes through newspaper stories and media representations and see that they actually go right back to the Victorian era and the advent of child labour laws in the 19th century. So I'm sharing some pictures. This is some really interesting scholarship that I've been reading from the 80s and 90s, such as Pricing the Priceless Child, where Viviana Zeliza talks about the changing value of children who became economically worthless but emotionally priceless during the 19th and 20th centuries. And also Carolyn Steedman, who studied Victorian child acrobats and describes how ideas about the inner self and our subconscious were developed through these cultural representations of children. So these are some of the academic books I've probably enjoyed reading most in the last year, so I definitely recommend them if anybody's not familiar. What struck me most about this debate on child exploitation is that despite well over 100 years of speculation, there's actually very little empirical evidence on how media participation affects children and whether it does have a long-term psychological impact. Exploitation, both now and in the past, tends to be something which is observed by concerned outsiders in a rather paternalistic way, rather than a complaint which arises from the actual people involved themselves. As Steedman says, their real lived experiences are overshadowed by the meanings that others impose on them. So, how can we understand this dynamic from a theoretical point of view? Are these people in fact being exploited, or have they become more like a vehicle for expressing wider concerns? I think to answer this, first of all, we need to think a bit more carefully about what exploitation is. So Raymond Williams discusses exploitation in another brilliant book, Keywords. He says its early usage in France and England at the beginning of the 19th century was linked to the feudal system of land management and the colonial exploitation of overseas territory. Initially, it was a word that had positive resonances in relation to projects that were deemed successful and lucrative, but later on it picked up these more negative connotations associated with slavery, subjection, excessive wealth, and deceptive practices. Exploitation, of course, is a core concept within classical Marxism, where labour exploitation is identified as one of the outcomes of the capitalist class's ownership of the means of production. But most scholars who've written about participants tend to make a firm distinction between on-screen subjects and other types of media workers, emphasising the power differences between the two. There's also an idea that what contributors are doing, and particularly reality TV contributors, is actually trying to avoid real work by using TV as an exercise in self-entrepreneurship, branding themselves as influencers and B-list celebrities. I think unlike more typical forms of work, there's a lack of any sense of coercion or consequence connected to people's decision to take part in a media production. Contributors don't say yes because of a necessity to earn money, to pay bills, or to feed their families, and in most cases, nobody would think any the less of them if they didn't do it. In fact, rather than seeing participants as exploited cultural labourers, the literature tends to view them as a kind of commodity, so more like raw materials in a production process who are fed into the machine and churned out again at the other end, lacking much sense of autonomy or agency. But the problem with thinking about contributors as passive entities or victims is it means we're failing to develop an understanding of them as conscious and motivated agents, as well as being potential subjects of exploitation. So what I want to do next is share some examples from my research where the productions that people were involved in were criticised for exploitive practice, and show how the perspective of the participants themselves might complicate or challenge this perception. This research mostly comes from my book, The People We Watch, which is based on in-depth interviews with a sample of 31 documentary contributors and producers. The productions were all UK based, but the interviewees were a really diverse range of people in terms of their social characteristics, such as age and gender, but also their subject positions and life experiences. The definition of documentary that I'm working with, as you might have already picked up, is purposefully quite broad because I wanted to reflect the different ways that people are represented living their everyday lives. The sample I chose includes award-winning cinema release documentaries, streaming content, but also factual formats which cross over into entertainment or reality TV. So the data was analysed using a grounded theory-inspired method, and as well as contextualising the findings within the scholarship about documentaries in the cultural industries, it's also filtered through my own professional background, because as Krista mentioned, I spent 15 years working in TV before I became an academic, and I'll talk about some of my own experiences later. So firstly, I wanted to talk about a Channel 4 documentary series called Shut-ins, Britain's Fattest People. So this was a programme which follows obese people undergoing weight loss surgery. When it aired, it attracted a lot of criticism in the press, and some of the newspaper reviews were very critical of the content, which has these sequences of excessive eating, huge plates piled high with burgers and chips, and quite gratuitous shots of obese bodies getting undressed or in the shower. One reviewer described the series as exploitative and troubling. So the obvious question is, why would anyone want to take part in this? But the answer is equally obvious, and that's that the weight loss surgery they're offering is only very rarely made available on the NHS, and at a cost of £10,000, it's unaffordable for most people to pay privately. For the participant that I spoke to, taking part in the programme was the only realistic way that she could access the treatment that she needed. So this already sounds like a troubling, exploitative dynamic, with people in vulnerable situations being offered the promise of a life-changing intervention. But when I spoke to this participant, the idea that she'd been exploited became a bit more complicated. So firstly, I found that she was extremely astute. It was a recommissioned series, so she knew the programme format, she'd already watched it, and she knew what would be expected of her. And she'd actually given a lot of thought to the risk that she would be exploited. Her calculation was that she would rather be humiliated than jeopardise her health. So her GP had previously told her that if she didn't lose weight, she could die. So in her mind, getting access to this surgery was worth the risk of being publicly shamed. Secondly, she told me she actually enjoyed taking part in the film. She felt she was treated respectfully, and the reaction she got from the public was overwhelmingly positive. She said the programme had changed her life for the better, and she had absolutely no regrets about taking part. So how are we to understand this from the point of view of a discussion about exploitation? Could it be said that the programme makers are exploiting people's desperation? Well, yes, I think that would be fair. But has this contributor been exploited? Certainly not in her mind. So she made a rational decision and enacted her agency in one of the only ways that was available to her, and the outcome was better than she could have hoped. The other thing I think this story highlights is the lack of public service, which played a role in creating this situation in the first place. And this was something that I saw over and over again in my research. People reaching out to the media because of a lack of justice for crimes that have been committed against them, a lack of representation for an issue they care about in the public sphere, or a lack of support for their mental or physical health, something that they desperately needed, which the production appeared to be offering to them. So I'll be interested to hear your views about shut-ins, and maybe it's something we can talk about in the Q&A. But to my mind, while the story doesn't exactly exonerate the filmmakers, it does show that participants aren't just passive victims who've been manipulated into doing something that they should have refused. So the next example I wanted to talk about comes from a documentary about stillbirth called No Child of Mine. During the production, there was a lot of criticism in the press about the filming methods, which were described by the Daily Mail here as morally repugnant. They quoted one hospital worker as saying women are being exploited for profit. So what happened is that the filmmakers in the hospital had come to an agreement that they could set up an unmonitored fixed camera in the room they used for confidential consultations, or the bad news room, as they called it on the ward. What they wanted to do was to film the moment when parents were told that their unborn babies had died. And the agreement was that this footage could be destroyed without anybody viewing it unless the parents gave their retrospective consent. So I spoke to one of the hospital workers who'd complained, and it turned out that she was not only angry with the hospital, but also with the newspaper, who'd incorrectly claimed that she had lost a baby herself, leading to a whole series of phone calls from upset family and friends. She said that she thought the whole idea of trying to capture this type of footage was so twisted, I can't comprehend how anyone could be so voyeuristic. But then I interviewed one of the women who eventually did agree to be filmed. By the time she got involved with the production, the idea of using this camera at the hospital had been abandoned, but she did allow them to film her labour and the birth of her stillborn baby, the final moments of her saying her goodbyes, and an incredibly moving scene with her delivering a eulogy at her baby's funeral. When I asked her if she thought the documentary was exploitative, she told me that she thought the absolute opposite was true, and that it was actually empowering. When her baby died, she'd felt furiously angry to discover that the UK has one of the worst rates of stillbirth in the developed world, and that a lack of investment in maternity services is one of the causes. As she sees it, the taboo around stillbirth and the fact that women aren't supposed to talk about their experiences has let politicians get away with making it a low priority. For this participant, speaking up in a documentary was a way of reclaiming some agency in a situation where she otherwise had no control. So she told me, I was just motivated because I was really pissed off. I still am to this day. I wanted to make noise. Furthermore, she told me she found the support of the crew was really valuable and that their care had played an important part in helping her to accept what had happened. When the film was finally broadcast, it was widely praised for its sensitive handling of the subject, including in the same newspaper, the Daily Mail, which had printed the criticism a year earlier. So again, what are we to make of this? What I think is important here is the alignment between what the participant wanted and what the documentary makers were trying to achieve. And I think this shows you can make films about really difficult subject matter if everyone is on the same page. However, I also think it's true that this participant's experience isn't the only thing that matters. And I think about the other women who were approached to film and said no, or who might have been horrified that the idea of being on camera was even part of the experience that they had. So the next example I wanted to share is a little bit different because the contributor was also the director. So Sue Bourne had made this film called Mum and Me about her relationship with her elderly mother who was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and living in a care home at the time. The issue of exploitation was front and centre from the beginning because her mum wasn't deemed to have competence to give consent to be filmed. So Sue told me that her long-time exec producer had tried to persuade her not to make the film, and it was only after she showed him the test footage that he was convinced. And this was mainly because her mother was such a larger-than-life character, and the footage was actually very funny and honest and loving, as well as sad. So they proceeded, but an advocate was appointed to look after her mum's best interests. But one of the main debates in the edit was the degree of honesty in the film. So Sue decided to include some quite unflattering scenes of herself losing her temper and shouting at her mum, getting frustrated when she was forgetful, ungrateful, or incontinent. Sue said to me, I had to show the bad bits. It wasn't there to make me look like a saint. You don't become saintly looking after old people. She's described the documentary as being a Marmite film, meaning that people either loved it or hated it. And the social media response was particularly harsh, with people calling Sue a monster and saying that she should be looked up. But there were also people who loved this film and said it spoke to their own experiences, which partly because of all of the ethical difficulties are so rarely represented on screen. So if we're still okay for time, I thought I might confess that I also have skin in this game from my own career in TV. So about 15 years ago, I directed this documentary series with Jade Goody after she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. At an earlier point in the production, the working title for the series was Jade Gets Better, and that's what we originally thought was going to happen. But every time Jade went to the hospital, the prognosis got worse and worse until it became clear that what we were actually filming was the end of her life. So the series became hugely controversial and we were widely accused of exploiting her, while Jade herself was criticised for sinking to new depths by monetising her own death. I can still remember getting on the tube to go to work in the morning and hearing people sitting in the carriage talking about it, while other people were reading newspapers with grabs from the footage that I'd shot with her plastered across the front pages. But for me, the exploitation argument never really made sense. So plenty of contributors, both before and since Jade, have documented their deaths in the media, from the Bowel Babe Deborah James to Terry Pratchett to Clive James, and most have been celebrated for their bravery. There was a sense, I thought, that we were exploiting Jade because she was unintelligent, but that definitely wasn't the case. She was extremely bright and very media savvy, plus had more agency than any contributor that I ever worked with. Jade had an open door to the edit suite in a way that I can't remember. I've never really heard of in any other production. What the public also didn't see, that many of the people making the documentary were her best friends. So the series producer was a bridesmaid at her wedding and they'd worked together for many years. Making the film meant that she was spending her last days with the people that she was close to, as well as the motive that she always asked when gave when asked, was that she was making as much money as she could for her sons, who were only 4 and 5 years old. So ironically, the stories condemning our production, which was made with her consent, were often illustrated by photos that were taken by paparazzi who'd been hiding in the bushes of her garden or who jumped out with their cameras when she was stretchered out of her ambulance at the hospital. Looking back, I think with hindsight, as the years have passed, there were things about the situation that I found uncomfortable, such as the fact that so many of Jade's closest circle of friends were also people that had a financial relationship with her. But I wonder how much of the misogyny and class prejudice that she dealt with in her life also shaped the way the media framed the story of her death. So this is one where I don't think I've got the critical distance to truly analyse the experience, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in the Q&A. And I think what I take from this is that there can be a huge difference between how something appears and how it feels when you're in the midst of it or actually involved yourself. So to wrap up, my main aim today has just been to show a little of the contributor's perspective, which has been underexplored by the academic scholarship, and which, as I think this paper demonstrates, can quite substantially alter how we understand media productions and the ethical issues surrounding them. It's important to say, though, that my research did include examples where people felt manipulated, commodified, and exploited by the production process. The potential for harm in these situations is very real. But nevertheless, I'd argue that exploitation isn't the most accurate framework to use to theorise the dynamics of participation, mainly because it places contributors in the role of passive victim and diminishes the sense that we build of their motivations, their conflicts, and their pleasures. So that's me. Thanks for listening, and I'll look forward to hearing your views in the Q&A.
Thank you very, very much. That was, yeah, fascinating. And yeah, shall we say very thought-provoking. I like this thought that maybe exploitation isn't a helpful word in the first place. I think that's quite, because it does become so complex. Has anybody got anything they would like to specifically ask or even suggest or discuss as a topic in this? Oh, already. Good. Dan, yes, please.
Hi, Emily. That
Hey,
was
Dan.
how are you doing? It's
I'm
fascinating.
good.
I absolutely really enjoyed that from someone
Oh,
who
thank you, Dan.
also works in
I was
TV.
going to
So
say, for those who don't know, Dan's my new colleague at the OU, who
yes,
himself has a 25-year career in TV production. So I'm guessing some of this might resonate with you too, Dan.
it absolutely does resonate with me, and I think really the TV and possibly the film industry are only now waking up to the fact that we do need complete care through production and aftercare as well. So my question was very much about is your research able to sort of make change or invoke any change, or has there been any presentation to the industry to say, look, this is my findings and this is maybe what we need to bring into policy, or that kind of sort of model?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. And did I see that Helen? Yeah, I did see Helen sneak in towards the middle of the presentation, because I think she would have things to say about this as well. So, I mean, the timing of it was quite interesting. I started this in 2017 or 2018, and it was really based on my own experiences. And I guess by that stage, I'd been doing my PhD for about a year, and realised that there was a real lack of conversation in the scholarship about contributors generally, which always felt to me like the crunch point ethically when you're working. The sort of the tension between what you've been commissioned to do, trying to do a good job, what you want for the programme, and feeling this kind of sense of obligation and care for the people that you're working with always felt quite a tricky area for me. So I kind of started looking into this, and then about a year into it, the whole duty of care scandal kicked off. And I think the debate has really changed during that time. And Helen, who's also on the call, is just getting towards the end of probably the biggest funded project about duty of care, which has gone on for about 3 years and has lots of buy-in through industry. So, I mean, yeah, I sort of sense, I don't know, I feel like I've sort of seen the whole thing come and go actually during the time of it, because I think there was a time when there was a lot of interest and people seemed really interested in hearing your findings and feeding that in. But I do get a bit of a sense now that there's maybe an idea that attention has moved on and there's a perception that the problem has been solved, which, I mean, I do feel like strides have been made, but I feel like a lot of what's been put in place didn't necessarily speak to the problems that my contributors raised. So, for example, there's been a lot of focus on bringing in kind of additional support from psychologists, but a lot of the things that my contributors were talking about were what happens within the relationships with the people that they're directly working with. And also, I think one of the things that was really clear in my research is the lack of support that those people giving care have themselves. So, for example, on the programme that I made with Jade, I mean, I don't think we had any support at all. I don't remember there being, I was a freelancer, and I remember it being, I was in my 20s, it was quite a young production team, it was really heavy, and I remember that being really stressful, and I don't remember there being any kind of formal, like, are you guys all right? You know, can we get you any help? Is this really, like, how are you coping? It was all just such a blur and a rush, and it developed in such unexpected ways so quickly that it was kind of deer in the headlights. So I do hope that's changed now, but I think there is still work to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Chris?
Hi there. Thanks very much for your talk. It's very, very interesting indeed.
Thank you.
When you talked about the Jade documentary, which I didn't know you were involved in, that was very interesting because I've studied Jade through my investigations of reality TV, and it made me think about this sort of shift away from sort of educational content that sort of is earnest, and this sort of acceptance of this sort of performative world that's kind of more ironic and sort of meets a mainstream audience. So I suppose my question would be is, will there ever be a return to sort of the more earnest and educational up front, or are we going to always be hiding it in a reality TV format? But actually, because I know that Channel 4 do this, they have very provocative titles for documentaries, but actually the content often is quite educational. So
yes.
Is there a problem with being earnest and educational, and do we need to live in this world of sort of entertainment and irony forever?
Yeah, no,
Probably a
that
daft
is
question.
interesting. I mean, I would maybe sort of challenge the distinction between the two a little bit, actually. I'm reminded, one of the directors that I interviewed was Jerry Rothwell, who's just a fantastic documentary director. And when I was talking to him about some of the films that I was studying, one of his points were actually sometimes these are very good films that are sort of disguised in quite a kind of tabloid formatted throwaway manner. But actually, if you look at the content and the dynamics and the relationships or the emotional territory that's being explored, actually sometimes it's a little bit undersold in the way that it's marketed, because there is stuff in there that's quite kind of moving and real. So yeah, but I mean, in terms of the sort of big picture, I mean, Dan might have more of a perception of that. I don't know whether you feel like there's a sort of return to kind of more serious or educational matter in commissioning. I feel like your finger's probably closer to that button than mine currently.
Well, I think at Channel 4, they still had that public service remit, so they'll always try and bring in some educational angle. If it's a pure doc, in reality, not so much, I would say, unless it was a formatted reality. So there was a competition element to it. Interestingly, Channel 4 have now just opened their first in-house development and production arm, and it's headed by someone who's worked in reality TV for 20 years. So it's definitely indicating from the channel, like only this week, that that is our direction. And there's always that sort of crossover. You know, if you think, I mean, in America, reality TV is tending to be more documentary and formatted, and suddenly we're now calling it reality, where really it might just be a straightforward documentary that we know. So it depends. I think. Just speaking to friends and people I know who worked in Channel 4, that they really are up against sort of other streamers and platforms when it comes to people sort of scrolling through what they want to watch in terms of that content. So they might go for the headline title, but actually the content might not be as headline grabby or sensationalist as the title suggests, and that's only because they're trying to draw an audience to their film. and the picture as well, the thumbnail is really important, and some commissioners only really need to see the title, thumbnail, and a very small paragraph for them to want to learn more on the idea, and that's something that Netflix will do as well. Absolutely. So yeah, sensationalist title definitely, but then the content might absolutely have more educational content.
It's interesting on that thought, just crossed my mind, is how Netflix morphs the thumbnail depending presumably on the algorithm of the viewer, which is quite an interesting thing. So yeah, it's a good point there. Very interesting, both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Emily? And you might not be able to answer this, so forgive me if it's a bit unfair. But I'm thinking about the sort of your sort of point about the slightly paternalistic use of the term exploitation, because we have to ask, if a person is themselves happy about doing a thing, is it reasonable for others to pronounce that exploitation? I mean, I would actually argue in some cases it probably is, but nevertheless, are there many incidents of critics or newspapers or whatever using that word to describe something they actually like, or do they only use it to describe a product they don't like?
Yeah, I do think it's mostly negative, but actually I feel like that's a really interesting point, and that's something that I was thinking about just yesterday. You know, if you don't feel yourself that you've been exploited, have you been exploited? I mean, how much are we positioned to be the judge of that ourselves? And I was thinking about that particularly in relation to this new project that I'm trying to get up and running about children's creative labour. And one of the stories that's in the press is about Leonard Whiting and Olivia Hussey, who were the actors in Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet in the 60s. So this is back in the late 60s when they were teenagers. They were filmed in Romeo and Juliet, and it became, it was a big hit program, and lots of people of a certain age, I think, a telly was wheeled out to their classrooms and they were shown it while they were studying Shakespeare and so on. And through most of their lives, they spoke positively about this experience. But then a few years ago, they tried to sue Paramount for abusing them as children. And they pointed out, as teenagers, they were filmed naked, and the amount of consent that they gave to the scenes that were filmed in the agency that they had, and it was lacking. And, there's reports of some troubling behavior and name calling and dynamics and that kind of thing on set. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously that was written off as being sort of opportunistic in some sections of the media and in some conversations, but I also thought it was interesting how long it takes to unpack this kind of dynamic yourself, that it might take decades for you to sort of reflect and process this situation that you've been on and see it in different ways. And, it might have felt very exciting when they were teenagers, but how that's sort of gone on and shaped their lives and their sort of changing perceptions, I guess, as they became adults themselves, and the kind of ages of the people that were in authority on that film themselves, how that changed their perception, I think is really interesting. So yeah, so maybe there is a bit of space for paternalistic calling out of exploitation too. But my main criticism, I suppose, it's not that exploitation doesn't happen. I think it's in the same way that documentary scholars had these debates around power a few years ago. It's just, has it become a sort of shorthand for something that isn't very well thought through and is a bit reductive and maybe squashes down the space for contributors to share their perspective? It sort of positions them in this kind of dupe and victim role, which, means that they don't have the same sort of authority and credibility in conversations that they should have.
I mean, I'm thinking about things like the criticism of things like Jeremy Kyle by people who did not like the show. I mean, so that when people are saying you are exploiting these people, it was also a way of saying, God, this stuff you're making is crap. You could conceive a situation where you might think, well, this is a really good film, but is that the right way to treat the person in it? But as I say, you don't often hear people saying, no, this is a good film, but I've got some question marks about the use, abuse, whatever, of your participants. I mean, those criticisms, do happen. But it's the same. I guess, historically, people talking about Now Look at the North's a good example. People say, yeah, great film, but on the whole, the Daily Mail type situation doesn't tend to be, this is a great film, but what about? It tends to be, I'm going to use this word exploitation as another way to have a go at you because I think this content's terrible anyway. It seems to me that that's mostly where it's wheeled out.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be muddied up with these sort of class and gender expectations. As I mentioned with Jade, I think the fact that she was seen as working class and female and young and so on, the way she'd been sort of framed before really seemed to affect, I don't know, I mean, it was kind of like she should be stopped in this, wasn't it? I mean, it felt, actually in the practicalities of doing that, how the conversation went was, do you want to carry on doing this? And she would say yes. And then the world would say no, but it's like, should this decision be taken away from her now at this point? Should she be stopped from talking about her story? And then it starts to feel, a little bit ridiculous. Why should she be stopped if she wants to? But anyway.
Colleagues, any other questions or points or observations that all Rowan?
Oh, hello. Did I get in just before Annie? Hello,
Yeah,
Annie.
you did.
You did.
I'll put this down. I suppose I just wanted to think more about this idea around exploitation. And are you going to sort of analyze where exploitation becomes sort of a long-term harm? Because certainly when I was making like arts telly, which didn't have any of the issues of class or kind of public exploitation around it, mainly because no one watched it. But I certainly felt, you were asking people often to contribute for free. You had, you're expecting them to give their expertise. This, often with academics, particularly, you're asking them to travel and give up time and, all of this stuff. And I certainly felt at the time it was often exploitative of the very least their generosity. So where does that point become, how do you define what moves from exploitation into genuine harm, and how do you kind of quantify that if there's, as you say, there's no real empirical evidence?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that reminds me of when I was working in TV as well. I think there's a sort of expectation of people's time, which maybe you could frame as exploitative. I think when TV had a bigger impact, there was a sort of, it felt like such an opportunity, to have your ideas exposed to millions of people. And maybe the dynamic of that has changed now that, you know, the viewing figures aren't what they used to be. But definitely we would be taking a lot of people's time and recycling a lot of academics' ideas, definitely, without credit. You're feeding them into the development process and using people's expertise in a way that was quite opaque and maybe not always recognised or rewarded. So yeah, I do think there's a conversation about exploitation through different production methods, not only participants, that I think is probably quite overdue. Yeah. And how we define when it tips into real harm, that's really interesting. But I feel like there's a lot of the question of long-term impacts is really unexplored. I think that's something that would be really interesting to sort of try and tease out. I think we're only just starting to think about impacts per se, but how they develop over time, you know, whether there is a long-term impact and what that might be and how we could measure it, I think it's really interesting. Maybe that's our next research project.
Annie.
Hello.
Thank you. Hello. Yes, thank you so much for that. And, you know, obviously really interesting conversations. There was a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, I've heard anecdotal chit chat through, you know, friends who are on reality programs and things about the fact that they had to, so they're in production, in the post-production side, and I believe some members of production sort of put in not a complaint, but a concern about contributor on contributor harm, in the sense that you're putting, you know, in a sort of a big brother risks kind of place, you know, so your people are in a space observation, that kind of reality telly, and the people that have been cast in those roles, you know, one of them was either showing very, very misogynistic or sexist tendencies, and or racist, you know, ways of being, of which was not cut into the program because that wasn't going to be part of what the producers would have put out. But that's a concern, isn't it? Because you're kind of looking at casting, you're casting the most interesting people that are going to create these sort of dynamics, which usually polarization. But that's what's kind of filtering through, as actually these editors are dealing with really concerning misogynistic male contributors and the harm, and perhaps also racist as well. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, talking about where you draw the line between documentaries and reality and how complex that is, one of the rules that I tried to make for myself, although then ended up sort of slightly bending, was that I would try to film people that were in their everyday lives and not in contrived situations that were set up by producers. Yes. So maybe those dynamics came less into play in my own research. But I do think it's interesting when you look at things like the ITV's guidelines around duty of care. There is talk about the level of construction, and I think there's maybe a bit of a sort of implicit understanding there that these extra levels of construction and contrivance maybe carry extra risks as well. So yeah, I do think that's really interesting. Maybe Helen. Actually, Helen's got her hand up. She might.
As you say, these people are going to go on to become influencers, but actually, what you're putting across is not their real personalities that the editors are cutting. They're cutting something else, which is more attractive, perhaps, you know, to the public. And there's one other thing I was just going to say was, what's your thoughts on the welfare producer role? And you know, is that a new role, or is that is it an expensive role? Is it actually a producer role? So I was just interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, those roles were just coming in basically as I was doing my research, and I think they're quite interesting roles. I mean, they've been described to me as kind of care bears. I think there's a lack of, I don't know how Dan and Rowan would feel about this description too, but I think there's a sort of lack of consensus about what exactly that role is and what credentials you might need for that. And it tends to be, it's quite feminized, and it tends to be a sort of caring, nice person who cares about their contributors, who is often sort of given that job. They're sort of seen as good, you know, dealing with upsets and ruffled feathers and sort of calming down situations. But I think there is a bit of a sort of conflict. Is that necessarily whose interests does that serve? Is that necessarily how best to protect somebody's welfare? I think all of those are sort of slightly muddied. And I've met some people, spoken to some people who are clearly very skilled at those roles. But I think there is a sort of lack of professionalization and kind of consensus generally about about how they can really be effective and what contributors need. The contributors that I spoke to generally really valued, assuming they had good relationships, really valued the support from the people that they were working with, and that's what they wanted. They wanted access to the researchers, the producers, the people that they'd been through this experience with, and the thing that they found tricky was that those people tended to finish after the edit's done, their contract's finished, and they're gone on to another production. And if they do maintain any relationship, that's out of the goodness of their own heart. That's kind of unpaid labor that they're just doing because they choose to, or they're a nice person, but it's not built into the production really at all. And actually, it was interesting that a lot of the people that I spoke to that were offered aftercare and kind of psychological support and the more sort of formal layers of welfare that have been brought in were often quite ambivalent about it, often never took up that offer, didn't ring that number, were a bit suspicious about it, thought there might be a conflict of interest. When if they'd had a problem with the production and the psychologist is being paid by the production, they saw that as a little bit, which I agree. So yeah, I think that welfare roles are really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your questions.
Neil.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, Neil. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. It's really great to learn more about your research. So thank you for that. That was really fascinating. And it was a question about kind of faithfulness and accuracy of storytelling, I suppose. And I just wondered, kind of given the pressure to tell the best story in the most sort of dramatic terms and raise the stakes, or whatever else it might be, whether contributors generally felt that their stories had been faithfully told, or were they ever kind of unhappy with the way their stories were told or edited? And as a sort of side question to that, I just wondered if any of the contributors ever had any editorial control themselves, or whether basically once they'd perhaps beyond withdrawing their consent, what kind of access were they given? Did they just see a viewing just before it was transmitted? Or so just, I suppose, a question about kind of faithfulness of storytelling, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think those two things are very linked, and I mean, it was, yes. So some of the directors that I interviewed and a few of the contributors were given a chance to see their film, their production before it was broadcast. And I think, for some directors, it was clearly a big priority that they felt that they had represented people accurately and fairly. And there's quite a simple mechanism to do that, which is showing people the film and sort of sitting with them in a room and, being answerable to the decisions that you've made. But I think there is a lot of resistance to that generally in the industry, and it's seen as really inconvenient and risky and time consuming. And, why would we give people this control if we don't have to? Quite dangerous. And I think there's a couple of sort of reasons that are often given. One of them is that, people tend to worry that they've worn the wrong dress or they didn't do their hair well that morning, and their concerns are quite sort of surface level and superficial, but, hard to deal with. There's not really much you can do about that. So there is a little bit of that, but I think there's also this kind of overstated idea that it's just not possible to re-edit something once it's finished. But actually, I think for most of us who've worked in the industry, there'll be rounds and rounds of changes. It will go to execs, commissioners, often quite a lot of people, and there'll be rounds of different changes, and that's kind of built into the editing schedule. So I think the idea that contributors couldn't have that themselves is a little bit, I think there is quite an easy solve for that if that is a priority, and that's show people your footage. Maybe not always appropriate, because sometimes you do want to make films that are critical, and I think that's also fair enough. But I think for directors who are working, you know, with very sensitive subjects or vulnerable contributors, or who, you know, who want to prioritise that. There is an easy mechanism there.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I want to go to Helen before we run out of time. We're rather hoping, Helen, that you can talk a bit about the contributor on contributor harm, but coming out of your research, but you've got your own question as well.
Oh, I did. Yes, we're finding that.
Hi, Ellen.
And there are, hi, Emily. Emily sits on our advisory board. So, but I didn't know so much about the Jay Goody story. So I'm really glad I got to see that.
I kept my own. I generally kept
You
my own
kept some
experiences
powder
away
dry.
from the research, because it just felt like, I felt like it was hard to find a sort of voice to talk about them and to be as objective about it. And actually, as I was reading through that section on Jade, I thought, am I being a bit defensive here? This sounds a little bit defensive. I think it's very hard to analyse your own research, but obviously I've got a huge history of all of this stuff, being on the right side of it, being on the wrong side of it. You know, I've definitely got my own skin in the game.
Yeah. But I mean, I wanted to say thank you for sort of pressing the point about agency, which we've, you know, been trying to do. You know, that there's a kind of, I think, even in the literature about certain kinds of people, class, gendered people, words like celluloid and all of the things that those men wrote about, you know, we're all positioned in the academic literature, a kind of lack of agency. And so, like, I think that's kind of really important. And some of the things we're seeing is actually people kind of rolling their eyes at the idea of another psych assessment, you know, participants like, really? Are you going to ask me if I want my dinner now? You know, that there's, and so somebody I listened to recently said something about the dial turning too far one way, and now it's perhaps coming back. But that's not true. It's not true to say we're not finding exploitation, and we're finding lots of agency too. But I was thinking that one of the things that's really interesting is the relationship between exploitation and consent, and the emphasis that's been put on the new rules around consent. So for like Eric Olin Wright in the class literature, there's exploitation where there's a dependent relationship. If there's a dependent relationship on life or being or soul, or, you know, those kind of things, then exploitation can occur. And he's very specific about that. And Dave can tell you about that, actually. But if you think about consent and the way it's been used to tick a box to say I've consent, I understood the format of the show, etc., then there's the idea that exploitation hasn't taken place because you've given right to it. But in the literature around kind of sexual exploitation, consent between people where there's an uneven power relationship doesn't necessarily matter anyway. That's much more complicated. So it's not that I have an answer to this, but I was thinking about how you're going to think about that with children in particular. Because consent seems to me have been wielded very publicly as a kind of fixed issue in the care guidelines, but also can be really reworked to your advantage to protect yourself. And I was wondering how you're gonna think about that in the next project.
I mean, that issue of children and consent is kind of one of the reasons I decided to focus on children more specifically, because I do think that's really interesting. So my old boss from ITV, you know, who I love and who made brilliant programs, had a really long career, he raised the issue of whether we should be filming children at all. And I was quite surprised at that. He was sort of saying, you know, children are very raw and kind of unformed, and the fact that we have this very easy sidestep for consent with children means that there isn't really adequate process that goes on. And I think what I found in my research is the programs where consent was a really obvious concern front and center, like Sue Bourne's documentary, you know, there's some actual kind of specific thought went into that, and, you know, something was baked into the process of making the documentary to sort of ensure that that was fairly robust. But with children, it's just, we can just get the parents to sign at the start, and then whatever happens to them is all fine. So So yeah, I think maybe that highlights the inadequacy of the way that consent is taken in TV. And I think on a practical level, I tended to do it at the end of the first day, and I would just give them the form and they would generally just sign it without reading it. And that was kind of it. And obviously they don't know what's going to happen. It's a documentary. They don't know how things are going to unfold. And you might be filming with them for months or years, and you still only need that one form, and and then they don't know how it's going to be edited. So so I think if we are saying that consent is a kind of remedy to exploitation, then the consent processes at a minimum need to be much more robust.
Yeah, problem. Yeah,
Colleagues,
I think you're going to get into lots of things with that.
Thank you so much. It is 2:00 and this meeting is scheduled to finish, and I'm sure some of you actually have to work. Some of us do occasionally, unfortunately. Much as I'd love to stay here and talk about this, thank you so much, Emily. That has been absolutely fascinating.